and subscribe.
They were small-time, pretty useless criminals when it came to it. They were twins, and they were murderous twins, and there aren't too many of those around. And that starts their little industry, really, because there were T-shirts, there were key rings, there were games. They loved being seen with celebrities.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're listening to Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the sins of the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. They had a status in gangland that has yet to be matched, and Ronnie and Reggie Kray are still making headlines today. Pursued by the infamous detective Nipper Reid, they ruled with fear over London's East End, while mixing with politicians and film stars. Movies, theatre and television dramas portrayed their lives, while an incredible 33 books about them have been written by friends, foes and lovers. Photographed by David Bailey, never have underworld gangsters enjoyed such X Factor. But was their stardom ever really warranted in terms of their criminality? Or does their fame overshadow their crimes? Today, I'm talking to criminal lawyer and author James Morton. In his book, Krays, The Final Word, he separates fact from fiction, and he tells me the truth behind the myth. So James, I was only looking at something last night and it mentioned that there was 33 books written about the Krays between the various members of the firm, the girlfriends, other people who kind of came in contact with them, and police officers. Everyone seems to have a book in them about the Krays. So I suppose you have now written what will be the definitive account, where you have challenged the myths and tried to tell the true story. But what is the obsession with them, and how has it kind of survived the decades?
I've no idea, quite honestly, because they were small-time, pretty useless criminals when it came to it. The other big firm at the time in South London were the Richardsons, who were far smarter, far more intelligent than the Krays, but they very sensibly kept their heads down under the parapet. The Krays craved publicity. They were forever taking out elderly boxers, failing film stars, Judy Garland, Joe Lewis, Sonny Liston. They loved being seen with celebrities. And that, I think, is part of their myth, that they created themselves. The second, they were twins, and they were murderous twins, and there aren't too many of those around.
No.
The third thing was that the East End was being revived after the bombing. It didn't actually pick up until the late 50s, early 60s. And also there was the start of the working class revival, in that up until then you had film stars like George Formby, Gracie Fields, but they were to a certain extent figures of fun. You now became involved with Arnold Wesker, the kitchen sink people, John Brain, who had room at the top, and working class people became people in their own right rather than just comic characters. And I think all those combined, plus, of course, 30 years was 30 years.
Yeah.
A long sentence on anyone's showing.
Longer career in prison nearly than they had in the criminal underworld.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
But I mean, the 30 years, the train robbers had got 30 years, but that was only half. They all came out after 10, 12, that sort of thing. But the twins, or Reggie actually, just did his 30 plus.
So it brings back to, like, you know, one of the things you've cited there as part of their celebrity is that they were twins. So they were born October 1933.
Yes.
And it was unusual to have twins then. Did they die during birth usually, or
Yes, and there was a tremendous infant mortality in the East End and indeed in slums generally around England and Europe really at the time. So there was a very high mortality rate, and that was a start that they survived. I think they were both quite ill very young.
Right.
Ronnie in particular, but he survived. And so that was most unusual. But I don't think that necessarily contributed to their fame. What really brought them to fame was John Pearson's Profession of Violence.
Right.
Which was really, for a long time, the definitive book on them. He takes them from really childhood to the time they get arrested.
Yes, yeah, which is in their 30s.
Yes, they would be.
Yeah.
They would be. If it's 1933, they're born. They're arrested when they're 35. Yes, 35.
So, in your book, you go through their childhood. They were obviously pretty much adored by their mother, Violet.
Yes.
The father was absent from the home.
A lot of the time, yes. He was on the run from being a deserter in the war and stayed on his toes. And he was a fairly useless criminal, I think. The one who should have had attention paid to him was their Uncle Alf.
Right.
Now, he was a class con man, receiver, involved in check frauds, and he was the person to whom they should have, and they did to an extent, look up.
Did he become a bit of a mentor to them as they grew up, or a father figure?
I would have thought, yes, he certainly becomes something of a mentor. And he ran with a man called Little Stan Davis, who was himself a very classy receiver and con man. And Davis looked after Ronnie after he'd cut somebody. He ran a caravan site down in the south of France, and he had Ronnie down there for weeks on end till it was sorted out.
While he was on the run or whatever, if he was lying low.
He was, lying low, I think, rather than on the run.
Right.
It all was sorted out and money changed hands.
But together they were sort of notably violent from a young age, weren't they? They were
yes.
down the country, out of London at one point, and they.
I think they caused chaos, just as an awful lot of, if I say, working class kids who were evacuees did.
Right.
As well. I mean, you've only got actually to read something like Evelyn Waugh's Put Out More Flags, and you'll see the chaos caused by London evacuees.
They were let run wild out in the countryside.
Just run wild in the countryside. The kids didn't like it. The people who had them didn't like them.
Yeah, the fresh air probably went
fresh air, yes. Well, it was the first fresh air they'd seen, of course.
Yeah. So when they started in their life of crime, I think they started with extortion rackets and acting as heavies for others. Yes,
there was a family, a North London family, to whom they were aligned, certainly. I don't know that they ever actually worked for them, but they were good boxers, of course, themselves.
Their grandfather, I think, was a famous...
Yes, he was a cobbles fighter, really. Right. But Reggie was in the ring and they were all in the ring, Charlie, Reggie and Ronnie, but Reggie was thought to actually have had the opportunity, as they say, to have been a contender. I mean, he won all his fights, he trained, but Ronnie would sort of brawl. Charlie wasn't really that interested. His last fight, he hadn't had a fight for a year before that. He was mixed with... I think it was a welterweight who went on to become British champion. He really got beaten badly. Then the kids, the Krays, go into the army, whereupon they dislike that intensely. They knock out the commanding sergeant the first day, go on the run. Very sensibly, they go a long way. They go straight back to Mum, where they're found the next day having breakfast.
She always takes them in, doesn't she?
She took them in, but that seems even about...
She's a typical gangster's mother.
Yes, absolutely, yes. But it seems that was about their intelligence, We won't actually go and live in Yorkshire, or we won't go to France. We'll just go back to Mum.
Mother, their ambition, You find a lot of these guys will reach the pinnacle of their career, but still they'll be living in the childhood home in the working class estate they grew up in. That still happens now.
Home, yes.
Yeah, their world kind of gets smaller sometimes the bigger they get. So Ronnie in particular, I think they have said, and you have said in your book, had a mental illness.
Serious mental problems.
Serious mental illness.
Mental problems. He was schizophrenic. I would have thought, anyway. And he really has to be on medication to keep him under sort of
Was it diagnosed now? Was it actually?
Well, I think it was, yes.
Yeah.
They had a tame doctor who looked after him, a man called Blasker, who, curiously enough, has now got a street named after him on the Isle of Dogs, Blasker Way, I think it is. But he was their tame doctor. And he kept Ronnie under medication.
So he was like their own doctor. That they.
Well, yes. Well,
was he doing it officially, or?
Well, no. All good gangs have got their own doctors.
Yeah. Okay. Don't know what they do anymore, do they? I suppose to stitch them up and that kind of thing. If they need to.
Bullet wounds, a shilling at times, sort of thing. Yes,
but that would have been recognised in Ronnie as the Krays kind of had become quite notorious in East London,
as they grow up. Yes.
He is. Much more volatile. He sort of loses his temper and is very violent. Was he sent to a mental hospital after a stint in prison for?
Yes. What happens is he goes down for 5 years, I think it is, over a fight down the East End in a pub called the Artichoke, where one man is really. Who had nothing to do with the opposition. He just happened to be there and related vaguely, and he gets cut very, very badly. Ronnie gets 5 years, goes to prison, and it works out reasonably well until he gets moved out of London, and he can't cope with the Isle of Wight, which is where one of the big maximum security prisons are. And he just can't cope, and his mentality deteriorates. And I think at one time he thinks the man in the bed opposite him is a dog who'll jump on his lap.
Right.
He really was seriously disturbed.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the great thing was that they got him out of a mental hospital where he was in a brilliant coup in that Reggie turns up dressed in the same uniform, not the same uniform, same suit, because the patients in the hospital wore civvies, and he turns up dressed identically. Ronnie goes off at the end of the visit, leaving Reggie, who says, well, I think I'm going home now. And they say, oh, no, you're not. Reggie says, well, why not? I'm Reggie. I'm not Ronnie. Ronnie, by this time, had gone up to Suffolk, where the good Dr. Blasker was ferrying up pills for him, and where they were ferrying up little boys for him.
Right.
But again, he didn't like the countryside too much. He was a London boy, and he pined for it. Eventually, he's caught after about a year, finishes off his term. But within a matter of months, he's back in hospital.
But the kind of game, I suppose, young twins would play in a schoolyard, pretending to others who they are, and they have sort of brought that into their criminality.
Well, I think that they did that regularly.
But they didn't really look alike, did they? Well, I mean, the pictures we've seen, did they?
Originally, well, eventually Ronnie puts on weight.
Okay.
But really, yes, they looked very much alike. One of them had a mole on the back of his neck. I think that was Ronnie, and that was the only way, when they were young, you could tell them apart. Because
some pictures, they seem to be varying heights. Maybe that was as they got older.
They were more or less 5'8", the pair.
Oh, I see, yeah.
Ronnie put on weight as he went and grew older.
Ronnie was he was gay, whereas Reggie was bisexual, and that kind of comes in and weaves in and out of their lives. And
of course, to be called gay in those days, the word didn't exist, or it did, but meant something entirely different. I mean,
and homosexual activity was probably illegal.
It was illegal, of course. And certainly to be a gang leader, just rather like being a footballer. In those days, you couldn't, or boxer, you couldn't possibly admit to being gay. And Ronnie didn't like it at all, although clearly everybody knew.
Yeah, and he was quite open, really, was he not?
Well, he was, but he didn't like being reminded. I mean, this is one of the stories, and this is the thing you can never tell which of the story is correct, but one of the stories about why Cornell was shot was because he had, in public at a nightclub, called Ronnie a big fat puff.
Right.
Saying, don't take any notice of him, he's just a big fat puff. And that really marked his death card.
Right. Okay. Yeah, because there were so many unusual points about them, really, wasn't there? That they lived in this hard man's world, and yet they were both,
yes.
Taking young boys into their homes and falling in love with them. And
well, certainly Ronnie was, yes.
Yeah, and yet then getting so deeply insulted if somebody mentioned it, that they were willing to go out and shoot them. There was a guy you mentioned, Bobby Buckley, an Irishman that was Ronnie's boyfriend, and you said in your book that he was in love with him. Do you know much about him?
Bobby Buckley, in fact, I believe was married.
Right.
But he was a very handsome boy. I mean, I don't know if there's a picture in that book, but there are pictures of him. He clearly was very handsome. Okay. He was thought to be the love of Ronnie's life. He eventually goes down because he's involved in a bank robbery which goes wrong in Islington in North London. He's left on the pavement when the others drive off, and I think he gets 4 years for it. Mm-hmm. And that was really the end of him. Eventually, he becomes terrified of Ronnie. If you look at the old Home Office records and the Public Records Office, he says, I don't want this. I won't give evidence for or against him. I just don't want anything to do with it.
He wanted to wipe him. I presume Ronnie had become quite obsessed with him.
I think
that ownership thing.
Yes, I think it's ownership.
Yeah.
There's a story that there was a boxing match at the Esmeralda's Bar nightclub, not the usual thing you got in top-class nightclubs at the time, where Ronnie Buckley is getting a bad beating, and Ronnie pulls him out and says, you mustn't have your looks spoiled.
Right. You mentioned there earlier on they liked good publicity. They courted the media, didn't they? They tried to highlight their charitable endeavours.
Oh, yes.
They opened a home for alcoholics, and they were, trying to have their photographs in, and they were courting celebrities and sort of trying to be seen as these Robin Hood characters, a bit like Pablo Escobar and others who've come along after.
And it depends on what you call charitable. And very much charity began at home. I mean, it's all very well presenting the prizes at the boxing if they've lent on somebody to provide the prizes.
Right.
And they did. I mean, they ran wrestling tournaments and boxing tournaments, but you had to pay for the half-page programme or the full-page programme, and I had to buy the flowers for the presentation to the mayor's wife. Right. And Tommy had to do something else. He had to provide the drinks or something.
So it was all for show for the media.
And how much actually went to charity, who can tell?
And do you think they liked the idea of being these celebrity gangsters? Was the celebrity as important to them as the money they were earning from their various rackets?
Well, the difficulty is to know how much they were earning, because I don't know that they had a high wage bill, quite clearly.
Yeah.
They had expensive tastes. Celebrity was the thing, and that's what you shouldn't be. It's a bit late for me to start saying you shouldn't be a celebrity gangster. That's the last thing you should be. You should keep your head well down, like, for example, Billy Hill, the London man, did, Arthur Thompson up in Glasgow, and I'm sure there were many in Dublin.
Oh, there are. I mean, the ones we're not writing about are really the ones who are successful. But there's I don't know whether you've read the book Freakonomics, but there's a chapter in it entitled "Why Do Drug Dealers Live with Their Mothers?" And it was a study that was done in Chicago, which tried to estimate what they were actually earning an hour, right, as a drug dealer, taking everything into account. Okay, they get the big hits, and obviously drug dealing is the major crime nowadays, along with extortion and that. But they'll get the big hits, but the way they spend and the way they blow it. They have no economic sense whatsoever. But they worked out that drug dealers earn less than the average wage, actually, on an hourly basis, and that's exactly why they live with their mothers. Because, some of these people that we talk about, these big gangsters and criminals, and they just never seem to have built up the wealth that you'd expect them to.
No, I mean, very few. Billy Hill certainly did. Charlie Richardson certainly did.
Right. And Billy Hill was the Krays mentor who...
Yes, he was.
They went to stay with him in Tangier in his house, and then it was said, I think it said in your book, that he became very frightened of them in his
Yes, I think he was frightened of them, and also having them around wasn't actually good for his image with the local police. And eventually they had to leave
because they were kind of threatening to put the heat on him.
I suspect they were. Yes.
By the 1960s, they're sort of legends amongst their own, and they're also big celebrities, really, in the UK. We go into 1964 with the Boothby scandal. Is that really what?
I think that's the start of their decline. Okay. They have this. Well, it could have been reasonable, but probably it was a scam to build properties in Nigeria. And Ronnie wanted Boothby to participate, or this is the alleged story as to what he was doing there on the sofa with Boothby, which was...
So he was a Conservative peer.
I think he was actually still in the House of Commons, but eventually he becomes a peer. But he may have been a peer at the time. But anyway, he shouldn't be sitting...
He's a big Whig politician, and he shouldn't be with the Krays.
He shouldn't be sitting on the couch with Ronnie, and certainly not with the other boy who was on the couch, who was called Leslie Holt.
Okay.
And who was a high-class burglar.
So this photograph is released through the media?
Well, it was going to be, but they shut it down. But the box, Pandora's box, had been opened, and now Labour members of Parliament, rather, were asking questions. Don't forget, this was a bad time for the Conservative government. They just had the Keeler Profumo affair, and they couldn't have another.
Okay.
And it was suggested that there should now be an investigation into the Krays to try and bring them down. It wasn't a success. Nipper Reid was brought in on the...
He was the policeman, the main...
Police officer, yes. He was brought in on the strict understanding that they had nothing against him, because at that time the Met police were in serious disarray. A lot of the detectives were not all they should have been, putting it at its most neutral. Nipper Reid was completely clean. And he started out trying to find some form of evidence that the Krays were running blackmail extortion. He couldn't manage it. He got hold of some frauds they were running, long-term frauds, which is buy goods on sell on credit, run up a bill and then get rid of the goods and have a fire if possible, so you get double from the insurance company. Well. But he couldn't. He got some minor people, but they wouldn't turn on the Krays. He went to the nightclub, people like Edmundo Ross, Al Burnett, who ran these smart nightclubs in London. And they said, no, nothing, Krays wouldn't touch us, but of course, that's not right.
Everyone was afraid.
Everyone was afraid. Yeah. Eventually, he's just about to call it a day when a man called Hugh McGowan comes up and says, the Krays are leaning on me in a club called the Hideaway Club in Gerrard Street. A friend of theirs came in, broke up the place. Next day, the Krays came round and said, we can stop all this. And Nipper Reid thought that was going to be the thing on which he could pin his investigation. Gets to the Old Bailey. The Krays he's not arrested Charlie, which was a great mistake, because Charlie worked the background and witnesses changed their minds, gave contrary evidence. So
this is the older brother, and he's out there, he's putting the pressure on witnesses and...
Well, arranging certain... Yes. They have a solicitor called Manny Freedy, who was a solicitor's clerk, actually, but he meddles in the case, putting it again neutrally. The jury disagrees. The second jury, by this time, they've investigated. The Krays have had the witness, Hugh McGovern, investigated. They discover he's got convictions for homosexual offences. He's been in a mental hospital. He's made allegations which he's withdrawn, and the jury doesn't leave the box. And now they're untouchable.
and they must have felt an enormous amount of power by beating the system.
Well, they were untouchable. Now you couldn't go near them.
Yeah.
That was the idea.
Yeah.
Nipper Reid goes off back to investigate the Colombian gangs coming over shoplifting for the World Cup, the Australian gangs and so on, and they're left alone. But that is when, unfortunately, the Richardsons become involved with Frankie Fraser, Mad Frankie Fraser.
And we move into a period when they become very murderous, the Krays.
Yes.
And I suppose by the end of the 60s into the early 70s, there's a second major investigation into them?
Yes, not into the 70s, but in the middle to late 60s.
Okay.
But by then, they've been acquitted of the Hideaway Club, and now they're celebrities. And they are, as I say, untouchable. The Krays then believe the Richardsons are about to try and invade their territory, which they're not. The Richardsons have got enough interests of their own. But they employ a man, or they become involved with a man called Frankie Fraser. There's a terrible fight in a South London nightclub called Mr. Smith and the Witch Doctors. A man is killed. Possibly the whole thing was set up by the Krays. The Richardsons are more or less wiped out in that they're all in prison waiting trial. Frankie Fraser's in hospital in prison. He's got a thigh bone shattered. They don't need to do anything more, the Krays, but now Ronnie decides, a Richardson man comes over to see another in hospital. The man is called George Cornell, who has called Ronnie a puff.
Yeah.
And he goes into a thing called the Blind Beggar, which is a pub where he drinks regularly. He was, in fact, an East Londoner, Cornell. And Ronnie hears of this and gets a gun and blows him away.
In the pub. These pubs have great names, by the way. We can't go further without that. They're fantastic names. But so Ronnie has that sense of empowerment he got from the acquittal of the trial, his mental illness.
Yes.
And that paranoia creeps in. Isn't that what happens nowadays? It's a well-worn path within gangs and criminal gangs, and you can see it again and again. And essentially, Ronnie is beginning to implode.
Yes.
Is that right? And the Krays are going to go with him, basically.
Yes. And they shoot Cornell. There's an identification parade. The barmaid is terrified of them, not surprisingly. They're not picked out on the identification parade, and off they go. And immediately they tried to release a man called Frank Mitchell from Dartmoor.
Yes, that's very interesting. What did they do that for?
Because they were losing they were losing face in the East End.
Right.
They were not popular by now. They'd become too much like bullies, too powerful. They were called Gert and Daisy behind their backs.
Who
were a sort of music hall. Dixon of Dock Green, Jack Warner's sisters, were a music hall act, and they were nicknamed after that. And this was to show, they say it was because they were afraid of the Richardsons and Frankie Fraser, and Mitchell was this enormously violent, enormous man.
Mad criminal.
Brute strength. He'd been in Broadmoor as well. And they were going to release him to counter the Richardsons. That's utter rubbish. The Richardsons had been destroyed. And they were never going to come out of prison. By then they were doing 5, 10, 20 years. And so this was just a bit of...
So what was it? So that they could do it, to show the world they could do it.
Show it, we can do it. And we can get the Home Secretary to give Mitchell a release date. They get him out. It's quite easy. Mitchell, although Dartmoor, you think, God, Dartmoor. He was allowed out on work. He used to have women paid for in the local town. He fed the ponies. He did no work. He did what he wanted.
Nice life, yeah.
Yeah, and then they arranged for him just to be at the telephone.
It was easy to escape him, essentially, because...
the warders were terrified of him. And they said, Frank, all right, Frank, be back at 3:00. And one afternoon, Frank wasn't back at 3:00. By the time they discovered he'd gone, he was halfway to London.
So they hid him out, and it sort of backfired on him because he became quite volatile himself in captivity.
Yes, well, he'd exchanged one prison from another.
Yeah.
They got him a girl from a nightclub who he fell in love with. I mean, you can understand how that would be. She does seem to have been very fond of him, and that actually brought the Krays down so far as the Mitchell murder was concerned. He was now starting to say, I'm going round to see, if you can't get me a release date, I'm going down to see your mother, which was, of course, fatal. I'm going to do this.
What was he threatening, to burn the house down or something?
No, I think, just go around and
threaten her by his presence.
Burn it down, but no, just be done. Yes. Anyway, they weren't certainly having him go near their mother. They arranged for him to be taken away and killed. And there was a man called Alf Gerard who was part of a thing which eventually became known as Murder, Inc. After the Americans. But Alf Gerard was a serious piece of work. And they take him away in a van, and Gerard kills him, shoots him.
Now, there was a third murder as well. Yes.
Oh, yes. 2 is not enough.
No.
What happens is that, for a start, there's a man called Jack the Hat McVitie, who at one time was a perfectly good, respectable bank robber, but later took to drugs, as you say they do. He was a friend of Mitchell's, and Mitchell has disappeared. We've no idea what actually happened to Mitchell. But McVitie starts making inquiries. The next problem is that McVitie is a drunk and a drug addict. He starts causing trouble in the East End. And eventually, the Krays have got a separate problem with a man called Payne, whom they believe is about to go to the police, who used to organise their long-firm frauds. Payne, they want rid of Payne, so they give McVitie £500 to go and kill him. McVitie goes, Mrs. Payne says, oh no, he's not in today. And McVitie, instead of going back on the Sunday or whatever, boasts in the East End, I've taken 500 quid from the twins and they're not going to get it back. And that doesn't help. Ronnie is also saying, look, I've done mine. Why, Reggie, don't you do yours? McVitie is invited to a party. Reggie tries to shoot him. The gun misfires. Jams. Reggie then stabs him.
Yeah, to death in the middle of, in front of people, and
in front of the whole gang. It's meant to be a party.
Yes.
Charlie is summoned to get rid of the body.
I mean, even in this day and age, that's when things are supposed to have got worse and worse. That's pretty horrific. Very violent. Very violent. Is Ronnie there? Is he looking at his brother?
Ronnie's there. Ronnie's egging Reggie on.
Yeah.
There are some people, some of them. What has happened is that after the Cornell murder, a lot of the gang disappeared. They thought, this is enough, I'm not becoming involved in this. And a whole new collection turned up, including the Lambriano brothers, and they were very upset at the party.
So it was too much for even a lot of hardened gangsters, what was going on. And the tide was going to turn on them, and people were going to... This fresh investigation, I think, was launched.
Yes, what happens is that now Mrs. McVitie starts making inquiries, and the police get hold of Nipper Reid again and say, look,
Try again. Yeah.
Now, Nipper Reid is desperately afraid that because of the leaks in the police, that the Krays will know of this. So he, in fact, sets up a rival establishment at Tintagel House, which is away from the Scotland Yard. Rather as royals today are setting up establishments separate from the household. But he goes again after the long-firm fraudsman. He gets hold of Payne, who is the one they tried rather vaguely to have killed. Payne helps him. Payne gets hold of a man called Gore, who was also a long-firm fraudsman. They persuade people to come in and give evidence. And eventually the they have a swoop on the long-firm frauds and a few threats. Mm-hmm. Once they've collected the majority of the gang, they collect the twins and Charlie at the same time. They then turns his attention to the murders. Mm-hmm. The barmaid they eventually coax
in the George Cornell murder.
Into the George Cornell murder. The nightclub hostess is found and eventually is persuaded to give evidence about Mitchell, and they find the flat in which McVitie is killed, and the woman, a blonde Carol Skinner, gives evidence.
So 3 women?
3 women.
Brought them down?
Yes. That's really what it comes to. You know, however people write and say, I brought the Krays down.
It really was that evidence was key. Yes. And was that sort of omerta that exists within that underworld? Was it not as awful for a woman to give evidence against somebody as a man?
To a certain extent, the barmaid is completely clean. The nightclub hostess is the worst fringe, and blonde Carol Skinner, they'd wrecked her house. And
well, it's brave going up against them, and I suppose then that starts, and then others come forward, and their own turned on them eventually.
Well, funnily enough, they didn't. The Lambrianos were offered every chance to turn on the Krays, and they wouldn't. So was a man called Whitehead. So was another man. They didn't. They stuck by the Krays, possibly because they were afraid of him. I think that's it. Rather than loyalty, they were just desperately afraid of what would happen to their families.
Right.
And it was all very well for Nipper Read to say, "Oh, well, you'll be looked after," but
he was brave, Nipper Read himself. They didn't go for him personally at any point, did they?
Well, they did. They brought a hitman over from America to kill him. But in fact, the word was out, and he was stopped at Shannon Airport, and returned to America. He was called Junior, apparently. He got a tattoo of a panther, so they knew who he was.
And they stopped him and turned him around and sent him back.
Sent him back, yes. But even so, apparently Nipper was had been one time fool enough to take the same route to his home to Tintagel every day, but that changed, and he started taking serious precautions.
So the Krays wound up, after much ado, getting very lengthy sentences.
Yes.
The 2 brothers, Ronnie and Reggie, they were separated behind bars, sent to different prisons. And that's really where their celebrity really, really begins. And I think that's, you concentrate a lot of the meat of your book on that time when they're in prison. And they just seem to become more and more famous and fascinating, and everything they do is reported on. And
well, first of all, Pearson's book comes out, The Profession of Violence, and that brings them into the public view again.
Right.
Then you've got the film with the Kemp twins.
Yes.
And that brings them into public view again.
Yeah.
And that starts their little industry, really, because there were T-shirts, there were key rings, there were games.
This I found
calendars.
Absolutely fascinating. Up until the 1980s, Richard Branson's Virgin Media Shop was selling calendars of the Krays. They're incarcerated on murder charges, and they're earning money from merchandise.
Yes.
Look.
The mugs.
The 80s were dreadful, really, weren't they? The things we did before the internet. But I mean, it's extraordinary to think. And they had mugs and
mugs, T-shirts.
And this has been managed on the outside by Charlie.
Yes,
Kray, the elder brother.
Charlie had help. Charlie couldn't manage a sweet shop, really.
Right.
He made a deal over the film, which was hopeless. I mean, if he kept, listened to somebody advising properly, they would have made probably millions. But as it is, he more or less sold the twins out for very few £1,000s. And they took umbrage and wouldn't talk to him for about a year.
Well, I mean, how did they fare out in prison? How did they get on? How did Ronnie get on? Was he medicated well?
Well, he wasn't.
Right.
Yes. They missed each other very much. Mother campaigned for a long time to get them put together, and eventually it was agreed Ronnie was out of control. Reggie might have some sort of influence if they were put together again. And at first there were thoughts that they were going to try and break out, organise a gang to have them released. And that was why all the members were separated in different prisons. So Reggie goes to Parkhurst, Ronnie goes to Durham, that sort of thing.
Right.
Lambriano goes to Hull. It wasn't, he didn't go to Hull, but they're put in separate prisons, all of them.
Well, so they can't operate.
So they can't operate.
Yeah.
But Reggie certainly manages a business perfectly well with Charlie, who comes out after 5 years. He got 10 for his part in the McVitie murder. He comes out and, to an extent, sets up a bodyguard agency which actually looks after Frank Sinatra at one time when he came over. But
and the books are being released constantly over those times.
We're starting these. We've got Cult of we've got Profession of Violence. Pearson does 2 or 3 more. Then you get Nipper Read in about 1990. Frankie Fraser has some come out which is about, a good deal about the Krays. And then you get the barmaid comes out of the woodwork. She tells her story. And
there's this insatiable appetite for everything to do with them.
That's absolutely right.
And yet, as we have discussed, like from a criminal career, they weren't really that exciting, were they? I mean, they were into their extortion rackets. They were obviously violent. They held power through fear for a period of time in the East End, but
only in a part of the East End.
Yeah,
that's the interesting thing. They didn't. We say they controlled the East End. They didn't. They controlled Whitechapel. They never went as far as the Isle of Dogs or down the docks. They would have had an awful lot of trouble if they'd become involved with people down Canning Town.
So society just has this appetite for every little...
I'm pleased to say they do.
Yeah, well, exactly.
I should worry, yes.
And you yourself had a lengthy career as a criminal lawyer, and interestingly, you look at the, the importance of lawyers within criminal gangs and that, which we often find, even back home, that certainly having a good legal advisor, be they trained or not, is something that's part and parcel of organised crime.
Well, what the Krays also did was they had a string of priests,
right,
and vicars who would come to their aid, which is, of course, something also you need if you're
in giving evidence for them, etc.
And indeed, actually, for example, one time the Krays were, I think, boating, and they thought the police were watching them, so they got a message to the local church, and down came the vicar, cassock flying, to say, "What are you doing?"
Yes, right. And did you ever represent them or anyone around them?
I did represent one of their relations on an identification parade, which was a complete fiasco. It was a bank robbery. There were, I think, 40 witnesses, and not one of them went near him. Right. It must have been just they round up the usual suspects.
Right.
I did meet Charlie. I met Gary. But I never met...
And was Charlie somebody that would be memorable to you, or obviously not?
Great deal of charm, but nothing more. I mean, he was a very...
You're left with the opinion that he couldn't run a sweet shop. Yeah. So, and were lawyers and solicitors and those sort of, again, a lot of legal people that surround criminals might not be qualified or trained?
They didn't have to be. They had to be attached to a qualified person. But for example, the man they had was either struck off South African solicitor or he hadn't qualified. He was called Manny Friede, and he looked after them from the hideaway down to the time they went to prison.
And I presume, within the legal field, that if you're representing some celebrity criminals, you get a celebrity yourself as a lawyer or as a barrister, or do people build careers on that?
it's word of mouth. How you build a career. Yes, to that extent, among the criminals, you get word of mouth. So I have represented Tommy Smith, and that's been a great success. He will go to his friends and say, oh, go to Morton. The same thing as if I don't get a good result for Tommy Smith.
Yeah. Well, look, there's rogues there's rogues in every business, including my own. But they are fascinating. What is your kind of overall view of them? Do you think that their celebrity is warranted, or do you feel that just a sort of a culmination of quirky
I think they were lucky in a way. For their fame, they were lucky. They were the right time, the right people, the right public. Now, actually, in criminal terms, they wouldn't last 5 minutes.
Yeah.
If you look at the people who I would not wish to mention, who have come after them, they would have been chewed up and spat out.
Yeah, and that seems to be the way as the generations come up. I think Ronnie died in prison, is that right?
Yes.
And Reggie was released with terminal cancer.
Yes, Ronnie dies, I think it's 1995. Charlie has gone down again on a big drugs deal. Ronnie dies in 95. Charlie dies in the spring of 2000. There have been tremendous long campaigns to get Reggie out. 30, he only killed his own. He, was kind, helped ladies halfway across the road and things. But if you read the prison records, he just will not realize that he doesn't hold the whip hand. If he's going to get out, he has to cooperate.
Right.
And he's found people in his cell drink. He won't go and see the probation officer that the prison want him to see. He has to see somebody he knows. He's forever changing his mind. He'll go and live in Warwickshire. He'll go and live in Somerset. He just doesn't cooperate enough. He certainly does when he marries Roberta Kray. But by then he's an old, elderly, sick man, and they let him out.
And where does he find her? She rides to him, I presume?
Sorry?
She rides to him, I presume?
No. She's sent down, I think, on a television company to interview him. And he becomes involved with her. She becomes involved with him. But he's old and sick, and he's, as you say, let out to die. I think he only lasts a fortnight after his release.
Yeah, and she's the grieving widow who orchestrates the funeral then.
Yes, well, originally it was going to be, we'd had one gangland, we'd had Mum's funeral, then we'd had Ronnie's, the Colonel's funeral, then we had Charlie, and then we had Reggie, but what she didn't want was another big gangland funeral with faces carrying the coffin, and to a certain extent she shut that down. Obviously she couldn't prevent a very big turnout, and I don't suppose she would have wanted to prevent a turnout, but it wasn't the gangland funeral.
She tried to rewrite the end of the story.
Yeah, I think she wanted to try and separate him at the end, yes.
Well, with what has happened since, even in his ongoing celebrity. But look, a very interesting book, and thank you very much, James Morton. That's extremely interesting.
Thank you very much.
The Krays, we're still talking about them.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please join our Facebook group. It's called Krays Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly, moderated group with over 1,000 Kray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.
Leave a like and subscribe.